All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into some pretty fascinating and, let's be honest, sometimes controversial ideas about U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah,
And we're going to be looking at the work of Jeffrey Sachs.
right.
Have you ever heard of this term unipolarity? It's this idea of a world that's dominated by a single superpower.
Mm.
And whether you realize it or not, it has shaped a lot of what has happened on the global stage over the past few decades.
Yeah, I think it's something that a lot of people don't really think about or
Yeah.
realize how much of an impact it's had on everything.
Exactly. So to
Yeah.
kind of kick things off, can you give us a little background on Jeffrey Sachs and why we should even care what he has to say?
Sure. So Jeffrey Sachs, he's an economist and expert in international relations.
Okay.
And he's been at the forefront of analyzing these global shifts.
Yeah.
And what's really valuable is that he's had firsthand experience with everything from economic development to conflict resolution.
Interesting.
Um,
Okay.
And he's not afraid to ask the tough questions,
Yeah.
especially about the role of the United States.
I like that. No holds barred.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So what's at the core of his argument here?
So Sachs points out that after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991,
Right.
there was this real sense of triumphalism in the U.S.
Yeah.
You know, they were the sole superpower,
Right.
and the prevailing narrative was that they were free to act without real constraints.
Kind of like standing alone on a mountaintop, surveying the world.
Exactly, like
Yeah.
they were the top dog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But how did that actually translate into foreign policy?
That's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
So Sachs argues that this unipolar moment, as he calls it,
Right.
fueled this sense of American exceptionalism
Right.
and a belief that the U.S. could reshape the world in its own image.
Wow.
He uses a pretty powerful phrase to describe this period.
Okay. What's that?
He calls it hubris.
Hubris. Okay.
Yeah, he doesn't mince words.
Yeah, so we got hubris, we got a sense of unchecked power.
Right.
That's a pretty strong claim.
Yeah.
Where do we actually see that playing out in the real world?
He points to a series of U.S. interventions,
Okay.
starting with the Balkans in the 1990s,
Okay.
and extending to Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria,
Huh?
even Sudan.
Wow, okay.
He argues that while these interventions were often framed as humanitarian efforts
Okay.
or responses to terrorism,
Right.
they also served a strategic purpose,
Oh, interesting.
expanding U.S. influence and preventing the rise of any potential challengers.
So not just reacting to events, but like actively shaping the global landscape.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about Europe during all of this? Were they just going along for the ride?
Yeah, that's a key question that Sachs raises.
Okay.
He argues that Europe, for the most part, followed the U.S. lead,
Oh, really?
particularly when it came to NATO expansion.
Okay, so this is where we start to get into some really contentious territory.
Right.
Yeah, okay, so NATO expansion.
Yeah.
That's been a hot button issue for years.
Right.
What is Sachs' take on all this?
So Sachs makes the point that after the Cold War,
Right.
the U.S. promised Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev
Yeah.
that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward.
Okay.
But as we all know, that promise was broken.
Yeah.
NATO started admitting former Soviet bloc countries,
Right.
much to Russia's dismay.
Yeah, I remember this being in the news, but I never fully understood why this was such a big deal.
Well, imagine you're Russia, and you see this military alliance that was once your enemy
Right.
creeping closer and closer to your borders.
Okay, yeah.
You'd feel threatened, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly how Russia felt,
Okay.
especially when it came to Ukraine and Georgia,
Right.
two countries that share borders with Russia and have historical ties to it.
I'm starting to see how this all connects.
Yeah.
So you have the U.S. driven by this unipolar moment that you talked about,
Uh,
expanding NATO eastward,
Right.
disregarding Russia's security concerns.
Exactly.
And all of this is happening while Europe is largely going along with U.S. leadership.
Yeah, and this sense of disregard for Russia's perspective
Yeah.
is something that Sachs highlights throughout his analysis.
Okay.
He argues that the U.S. consistently underestimated Russia's reaction to NATO expansion,
Wow.
believing that they would simply accept it as a fait accompli.
A misreading of the situation.
Yeah.
A failure to understand Russia's motivations.
Pretty much.
Okay. This brings us to another key theme that Sachs explores. This idea of regime change.
Mm-hmm.
He suggests that the U.S. has this long history of interfering in other countries' internal affairs
Right.
to install governments that are more aligned with U.S. interests.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so he brings up the 2014 Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine as like a prime example of this.
Yeah.
Could you remind us what happened there?
So there were protests and violence and ultimately a change in government.
Right.
Um,
And Sachs argues that the U.S. was deeply involved in the events that led to the ouster of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych,
right.
who is seen as pro-Russian.
Right.
So how does Sachs connect all of this to this broader picture of U.S. foreign policy?
So while it was presented as the U.S. supporting democracy,
Right,
Sachs argues that the U.S. intervention in Ukraine was
right.
actually part of a larger strategy to weaken Russia and expand Western influence.
Okay.
He points to these intercepted phone calls between U.S. officials
Oh, really?
that seem to confirm their involvement in shaping the post-Yanukovych government.
Wow.
He believes this further alienated Russia
Right.
and set the stage for the conflict that erupted in 2022.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah,
Each U.S. action leading to another, culminating in this current crisis.
exactly.
So were there any attempts to, like, de-escalate the situation before it got to this point?
There were some attempts, but according to Sachs,
Okay.
they were half-hearted at best.
Oh, wow.
He argues that the U.S. and its European allies repeatedly dismissed Russia's security concerns,
Right,
refusing to engage in any serious negotiations about limiting NATO expansion
right.
or finding a mutually acceptable solution to the Ukraine issue.
So a missed opportunity to prevent a major conflict?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
This idea of the U.S.'s unipolar moment,
Mm-hmm.
NATO expansion,
Right.
regime change in Ukraine,
Yay.
and this breakdown of diplomacy.
Right.
It's clear that Sachs believes U.S. foreign policy played a major role in escalating tensions with Russia.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? Is there any way out of this mess?
That's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay,
Sachs does offer some ideas about how to move forward,
okay,
but they require a fundamental rethinking of U.S. foreign policy
okay.
and a willingness to engage with Russia in a more constructive way.
Okay, so a glimmer of hope,
Yeah,
but it doesn't sound easy.
not at all.
Okay, we'll be back after a short break to delve into Sachs's vision for a more peaceful and stable world.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've established that Sachs sees U.S. foreign policy as this major driver of global instability,
Right.
but it's easy to criticize.
Yeah.
What's his vision for, like, a better way forward?
Well, that's where Sachs gets really interesting.
Okay,
He isn't just a critic, he's also a pragmatist looking for solutions.
okay.
And he believes that the first step is acknowledging that the world has changed.
How so?
Well, the era of unipolarity, that U.S. dominance we were talking about,
Right.
is fading.
So no more America as the world's policeman?
Not exactly.
Okay,
He believes that the U.S. still has a role to play,
right.
but it needs to adjust to a world where power is becoming more diffused.
Okay,
We're moving toward a multipolar system with multiple centers of influence.
okay.
China, the EU, India, and others are all rising in prominence.
Right, it's like that old saying.
Yeah.
Pride comes before the fall.
Exactly.
If the U.S. keeps clinging to this unipolar mindset, they risk falling behind.
Exactly. Clinging to the old playbook,
Okay.
military interventionism, regime change, a go-it-alone attitude,
Right.
that's a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so what's the alternative?
He suggests that the U.S. needs to rediscover the art of diplomacy,
Okay,
rebuild alliances based on mutual respect,
okay.
and start working within a multilateral framework where international law and cooperation are prioritized.
So less my way or the highway,
Right.
and more let's find common ground.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does he see this playing out in, like, specific areas of conflict, like Ukraine, for example?
Well, Sachs is very clear that the current crisis in Ukraine is a direct consequence of the failures of U.S. foreign policy over the past 3 decades.
Right,
This relentless push for NATO expansion, the disregard for Russia's security concerns, the meddling in Ukrainian internal affairs,
right.
all of these things contributed to creating the conditions for this conflict.
Okay, but now that the conflict is actually happening,
Yeah.
what's the solution? Does he think the U.S. should just walk away and let Russia have its way?
Not at all.
Okay,
He advocates for a negotiated settlement
okay,
that addresses the legitimate security concerns of both Russia and Ukraine.
okay.
But he stresses that this will require the U.S. to finally acknowledge its own role in the crisis
Right.
and be willing to make concessions.
Like what? What kind of concessions?
Well, for one, he believes that the U.S. needs to abandon its insistence on Ukraine joining NATO.
Okay,
He argues that this is a non-starter for Russia
Right.
and a major obstacle to peace.
okay,
He also suggests that the U.S. needs to stop pouring weapons into the conflict
right.
and instead focus on creating the conditions for a ceasefire and meaningful negotiations.
So a more pragmatic approach,
Right.
recognizing that there are no easy solutions
Exactly.
and that compromise is essential.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Europe.
Okay.
Where does Europe fit into all of this in Sachs's vision for a multipolar world?
This is where Sachs gets really interesting.
Okay.
He believes that Europe has a crucial role to play in creating a more stable and peaceful world order.
Okay.
But to do this, it needs to break free from its dependence on the U.S.
Really?
and develop its own independent foreign policy.
Hold on. Is he suggesting that Europe should abandon its alliance with the U.S.?
Not necessarily abandon it,
Okay.
but definitely rethink it.
Okay.
Sachs argues that Europe has become too reliant on the U.S. for its security,
Okay.
often following its lead without questioning its motives
Yeah.
or considering the consequences.
Right.
And he believes this has weakened Europe's position on the global stage
I see.
and prevented it from playing a more constructive role in resolving conflicts.
So if you're always following someone else's lead,
Right.
you're never really in control of your own destiny.
Exactly.
What would a more independent European foreign policy actually look like?
Well, Sachs lays out a few key elements.
Okay.
First, he stresses the need for Europe to invest in its own defense capabilities,
Okay.
rather than relying solely on the U.S. for protection.
So standing on its own 2 feet.
Exactly.
Makes sense. What else?
Second, Sachs calls for Europe to engage in direct dialogue with Russia,
Okay.
addressing its legitimate security concerns, and working towards a mutually acceptable solution to the current conflict.
Okay.
He believes that Europe, due to its geographic proximity and historical ties,
Right.
is in a unique position to bridge the divide between Russia and the West.
That sounds like a tall order,
It's definitely a challenge.
especially given the current state of sections.
Right, but Sachs argues that dialogue is crucial,
Oh,
even or perhaps especially during times of crisis.
Okay.
He points to the example of Willy Brandt,
Okay.
the former West German chancellor who pursued Ostpolitik,
Right.
a policy of détente with East Germany and the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Right.
Brandt believed that dialogue, however difficult,
Yeah.
was the only way to reduce tensions and build trust.
So a historical precedent for engaging with even your adversaries.
And-
Interesting. But what about the specifics? How can Europe address Russia's security concerns without compromising its own values and principles?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And Sachs doesn't offer easy answers.
Of course not.
He acknowledges the complexities,
Yeah.
but suggests that a solution could involve some form of neutrality for Ukraine,
Okay.
security guarantees for all parties involved,
Right.
and a framework for economic cooperation that benefits both Russia and Europe.
So finding that delicate balance
Yeah,
sounds like a diplomatic tightrope walk.
it is.
Anything else on Europe's role?
Yes, Sachs believes that Europe needs to become a champion for multilateralism,
Okay.
a world order based on cooperation and shared responsibility,
Right.
not on the dominance of a single power.
Okay.
He sees this as the only way to address the global challenges we face,
Right.
from climate change to pandemics to poverty.
So a shift away from America first
Exactly.
and towards a more collaborative approach to global problem solving.
Exactly.
But can Europe really pull this off? It's not like they can force other countries to cooperate.
Right, but Sachs believes that Europe can lead by example,
Okay.
by promoting diplomacy over confrontation,
Okay.
by investing in sustainable development,
Right.
and by upholding democratic values.
Okay.
He sees Europe as a potential counterweight to the more unilateral and often aggressive approach favored by the U.S.
Okay, so Europe as this force for peace and cooperation on the global stage.
Right.
What about other regions like the Middle East and Asia?
Yeah.
Does Sachs have anything to say about those?
He does. In fact, he's quite critical of U.S. policy in the Middle East.
Okay.
He argues that it's been heavily influenced by what he calls the Israeli lobby,
Okay.
and that this has led to a neglect of Palestinian rights and a focus on confrontation with Iran.
Okay.
He believes that a more balanced approach,
Okay.
one that takes into account the interests of all parties involved,
Right.
is essential for achieving peace and stability in the region.
That's a pretty controversial statement.
Oh, definitely.
I can already imagine the pushback he's getting on that one.
Oh, yeah. Sachs doesn't shy away from tackling sensitive issues,
Right.
which is what makes his analysis so compelling.
Right.
He challenges conventional wisdom and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths.
Okay, so Middle East policy needs a major overhaul, according to Sachs.
Pretty much.
What about China? They're obviously becoming a major player on the global scene.
Right.
How does he see U.S.-China relations evolving?
He's actually quite concerned about the growing rivalry between the U.S. and China.
Okay.
He argues that the U.S. views China's economic success as a threat,
Okay.
and that this has led to a confrontational approach
Right.
characterized by trade wars and military buildups.
Right.
Sachs sees this as a dangerous path,
Okay.
one that could easily lead to conflict.
So another potential flashpoint.
Yeah.
What does he propose instead?
Sachs advocates for finding common ground and cooperation between the U.S. and China. He believes that both countries have a shared interest in addressing global challenges like climate change,
Right.
pandemics, and poverty.
Okay.
He argues that by working together,
Yeah.
they can create a more stable and prosperous world for everyone.
Cooperation over confrontation
Right.
seems to be the recurring theme in Sachs's analysis.
Yeah.
But is it realistic? Can countries with such different values and interests really find ways to work together?
That's the challenge.
Right.
And Sachs doesn't pretend it will be easy,
Right.
but he believes it's the only way forward.
Okay.
He argues that in an increasingly interconnected world,
Right.
our fates are intertwined.
Right.
We can either choose to cooperate
Yeah.
or face the consequences of our divisions.
So a stark choice.
Yeah.
Cooperation or conflict.
Pretty much.
Wow. What a way to end this part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
I'm definitely going to need some time to digest all of this.
Yeah, for sure.
What are Sachs's final thoughts on how to build a more peaceful and stable world?
That's a great question.
We'll explore that in the final part of our deep dive. So we've been on quite a journey with Jeffrey Sachs, exploring his critiques of U.S. foreign policy and his vision for this multipolar world.
Right.
There's this one concept he brings up that I find particularly intriguing.
Okay.
It's this idea of Finlandization.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. Finlandization often gets kind of a bad rap,
Right.
but Sachs sees it in a more nuanced light.
Okay.
Essentially, it refers to Finland's strategy during the Cold War.
Right.
They managed to maintain their independence and avoid conflict
Okay.
by staying neutral
Right.
while still having strong economic ties with the Soviet Union.
Interesting.
It was a delicate balancing act.
So like playing both sides without picking a side?
Yeah, kind of.
How would that apply today?
Sachs suggests that this model, adapted to the current context, of course,
Right.
could offer a path forward for countries like Ukraine,
Okay.
Georgia, or even Moldova,
Okay.
nations that are caught in this tug of war between Russia and the West.
Right, right,
He's not saying these countries should become mini Finlands overnight,
right.
but rather that their security and well-being might be better served by not being forced to choose sides
Okay.
in this geopolitical rivalry.
It's like saying, hey, let's not make this a binary choice between Russia or the West.
Right.
Maybe there's a third way
Exactly.
that allows these countries to kind of chart their own course
Right.
while maintaining good relations with everyone.
Exactly. Sachs believes that this kind of approach would reduce tensions, enhance regional stability, and ultimately benefit everyone involved.
Right.
He's pushing back against this idea that security is a zero-sum game,
Okay.
where one country's gain is automatically another's loss.
I see.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting concept,
Yeah.
especially given the current tensions.
Right.
So if we zoom out a bit, what's the big takeaway from Sachs's analysis?
Well, I think it boils down to this.
Okay.
We are living through a major historical transition.
Okay.
The old world order,
Right.
the one dominated by a single superpower,
Oh.
is fading,
Okay.
and a new multipolar world is emerging.
Right.
It's a world where power is more diffuse, more complex,
Right.
and frankly, more unpredictable.
Yeah. It's both exciting and a bit daunting at the same time.
Definitely, but Sachs, despite all of his critiques,
Right.
maintains a sense of cautious optimism.
Okay.
He believes that this shift towards multipolarity,
Yeah.
while presenting challenges, also holds tremendous potential for a more just peaceful and sustainable world.
Okay.
But it requires a fundamental change in mindset,
Okay.
a shift away from this zero-sum mentality that has dominated international relations for far too long.
So it's not just about rearranging the pieces on the global chessboard.
Right.
It's about changing the rules of the game entirely.
Exactly. Sachs calls for a new approach based on cooperation, dialogue, and mutual respect.
Okay.
He argues that by embracing multilateralism, investing in sustainable development,
Right.
and prioritizing diplomacy over military intervention,
Okay.
we can create a world where every country, regardless of its size or power,
Yeah.
has a chance to thrive.
It's a powerful vision.
Yeah.
But it also seems incredibly difficult to achieve.
Yeah, for sure.
It requires trust-building compromise
Right.
and a willingness to put aside short-term interests for the sake of long-term global well-being.
Exactly.
Is humanity even up to the challenge?
That's the question we all need to grapple with.
Yeah.
Sachs's analysis, as you've seen, is a wake-up call.
Right.
It's urging us to rethink our assumptions about power security and the very nature of international relations.
Right.
And it's a call to action,
Okay.
not just for policymakers and diplomats,
Right.
but for all of us, citizens, activists, anyone who cares about the kind of world we're leaving for future generations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Jeffrey Sachs's world,
Yeah,
it comes back to you, the listener.
yeah,
What resonates with you?
right.
Do you agree with Sachs's assessment?
Right. What are your hopes and fears about the future of global politics?
We encourage you to continue exploring these questions.
Yeah,
Dig deeper,
right.
challenge your assumptions, and
Absolutely.
engage in constructive conversations about the kind of future you want to see.
Because ultimately, the world we create is the result of the choices we make individually and collectively.
That's a powerful note to end on.
Yeah,
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the complex and ever-evolving world of U.S. foreign policy and global affairs.
it's been a pleasure.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging with the big ideas that are shaping our world.